Thank you so much for helping us. So this is just to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. Thank you all for staying with us through a little bit of technical difficulties, but gladly they have been solved. My name is Manuel Bautista Gonzalez. I am a postdoc researcher at the University of Oxford. This is the last session of the Financial History Network webinar series, an initiative that was launched in August 2020 in the midst of a pandemic to help develop new work in financial history and the history of finance. And today we are very pleased to have with us Professor Sharon Ann Murphy from Providence College. Sharon Ann Murphy is a professor of history at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. Her research and teaching interests are in 19th century US history, particularly concerning banking, insurance, slavery, and finance. Professor Murphy earned her BA and PhD in history at the University of Virginia. She is the current president of the Business History Conference. She is the author of Investing in Life, Insurance in Antebellum America, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, 2010, and also a winner of the 2012 Hagley Prize for the best book in business history, and Other People's Money, How Banking Worked in the Early American Republic, Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2017. Her newest book and the topic of today's talk is titled Banking on Slavery, Financing Southern Expansion in the Antebellum United States, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 2023. So just for everyone to remember the format of our talks, our speaker will have 30 minutes to, the floor will be hers, and then there will be a question and answer session for everyone to make questions about the talk. Thank you, Sharon, for joining us. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. First, I'd really like to thank my good friend Manuel for that kind introduction. And for all the organizers of the Financial History Network for inviting me to give this book talk. I'm actually traveling for a funeral, so I'm in my mother's office right now rather than at home, but probably added to the confusion. But so this project directly emerged from my last book, Other People's Money, How Banking Worked in Antebellum America. And that was my first attempt to teach basic financial literacy on Antebellum America to a broad historical audience. But as I was writing my section on the relationship between banking and slavery, I was really struck by how anemic the discussion was. Very few secondary sources even broached the topic at all. The few that did discuss slavery tended to focus on the short-lived plantation banks, which were a very specific type of property bank during the 1830s. Others examined the relationship between large merchant bankers and the global cotton trade. Others looked at the use of enslaved people in more general credit transactions, largely outside of the formal banking industry. On the other hand, the major scholarship on commercial banking, even an extremely prominent monograph on Southern banking, made no mention of slavery, or almost no mention of slavery. So was there really no substantial connection between banking and slavery in antebellum America? So that's what I wanted to find out. And as I made the decision to dig into this new question, I specifically wanted to focus on those ways that Southern commercial banks directly, knowingly, and explicitly interacted with the slave system. Now, I assumed that the best place to start would be with the large, more mature banks of the Eastern Seaboard in places like Virginia and North and South Carolina. But what I quickly discovered was that the financing of the slave economy did not fit well with traditional commercial banking practices. In the antebellum period, commercial banks were chartered through individual acts of incorporation by each state, which granted them the privilege of issuing banknotes and defined the basic terms of lending in which they could engage. The first and second banks of the United States also operated as commercial banks, but with federal charters and with branches throughout the United States. And Southern states typically chartered large state banks, the Bank of Virginia, for example, with branches throughout the state. Northern banks were more typically smaller unit banks with no branching privileges. So the most common type of lending engaged in by commercial banks in both the North and the South was discounting, which was a very specific type of short-term loan, mainly for business people engaged in trade. So a merchant would obtain goods from a seller by issuing a promissory note, often referred to as commercial paper, promising to pay the full amount at some specified future date after he had sold the goods in question. The seller could then add his name to the note, making it double name paper, and take this note to a bank to be discounted. So the bank would loan the person the face value of the note, less a discount reflecting the interest rate. For example, a typical bank charter, commercial bank charter stated, quote, the president and directors may discount notes or bills at any length of time, not exceeding 60 days, but may renew the same from time to time at pleasure. So the charter itself explicitly defined the lending terms of the banks. Proponents of sound banking asserted that discounting was the safest type of loan because these loans were backed by real commodities, goods in transit, items awaiting sale, a harvest about to be shipped, and so forth. And these loans were short-term, usually only 30 to 60 days, and self-liquidating, meaning that as soon as the sale was completed, the note would be repaid. Now, in actuality, these notes were often renewed, but the bank would require the payment of an additional discount with each renewal. And at any point, the bank could decline the renewal and demand payment in full. So these features, particularly the short-term nature of the loans, was also what made these loans of little use in the agricultural sector. So most banks were chartered for urban areas and tended to serve a mercantile clientele. These features also made these banks of little direct use for the slave economy. Again, I'm not denying or downplaying the numerous indirect ways that banks may have supported slavery, for example, by financing the trade in goods produced by enslaved people. But bank financing of the international cotton trade, for example, could have occurred in a counterfactual universe without slavery. Instead, my focus is on those direct interactions between commercial banks and the slave system. And the traditional structure of commercial banks made them of little use to the slave economy during the first 2 decades of the 19th century. However, even if these traditional commercial banks did not initially promote and directly support the slave economy, many of these banks still directly interacted with the slave system. So first, if the debtor failed to repay the loan, the bank could sue the debtor and or any endorsers of the note in question for repayment. The court would issue an order of fieri facias, or FIFA for short, which allowed the sheriff to seize and sell the property of the debtor or any of the endorsers in payment of the delinquent obligation. And it was through these FIFA judgments that early banks first engaged directly with human property. Southern banks willingly seized and sold enslaved people as part of these foreclosure proceedings. Second, if a debtor wished to renew a discount loan, the bank could ask for additional securities to secure the loan. In the South, banks regularly accepted enslaved people as mortgage collateral for the securitization of existing short-term loans. Thus, these traditional commercial banks were certainly interacting with the slave system, even if they were doing little to directly support or further the expansion of slavery. By their nature, traditional commercial banks were conservative entities that did not provide the type of financial assistance needed by most slaveholders, namely long-term loans in larger amounts than what was permitted by most bank charters, backed by landed or enslaved property. So in the settled areas of the Atlantic seaboard, most banks would maintain this conservative focus throughout the antebellum period. But the population was rapidly expanding westward during these first decades. On the southern frontier, where farmers believed the ownership of enslaved labor to be essential to their success, and where much of the region's wealth was invested and stored in these same enslaved bodies, this discrepancy between banking practices and local demands initially hampered growth. Yet during the post-war of 1812 boom, as average slave prices rapidly increased, frontier bankers in the growing states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana became increasingly comfortable with actively treating enslaved people as financial assets, even as traditional banking norms continued to constrain their support of westward expansion. Let me give just one example. During the height of the post-war of 1812 boom, brothers-in-law and business partners Armstead Moorhead and Robert Latham of South Central Kentucky habitually discounted their short-term business paper with the Russellville branch of the Bank of Kentucky. While the partners occasionally repaid these notes, they more often renewed them repeatedly with the bank to maintain greater liquidity for their business operations. By October 1817, the pair owed the Bank of Kentucky just shy of $16,000 on more than a dozen notes worth anywhere from $250 to $3,000 each. Feeling uneasy with this substantial growing debt, the bank requested that they provide additional security. As a result, the partners mortgaged to the bank 20 enslaved individuals, along with some other property. Treating this mortgage as a line of credit, over the next 2 years, the pair periodically repaid earlier debts while adding new ones onto the same mortgage. While this arrangement technically did not violate the bank's charter, repeatedly renewing such a large debt did challenge traditional conservative banking principles. It would also place the bank in a difficult position of having to seize and sell land and human property if the pair defaulted, as they soon would. And in the event of an economic downturn, such as the unprecedented Panic of 1819, the collateral might prove insufficient to cover the balance due. Despite the massive disruption of the first national panic in 1819, the banking system of the South emerged largely intact. With only very few exceptions, the business model of all these banks, including the Second Bank of the US, and those large state-owned banks, as well as those in the frontier South, remained discounting short-term commercial paper, which could be regularly renewed and secured with mortgages on land or human property. Yet a few banks, especially those operating on the frontier, like the Bank of Kentucky, started actively pushing against these boundaries, allowing businessmen to accumulate increasingly large debts from discounting business notes, which were repeatedly renewed using land and enslaved individuals as collateral. The largely positive experiences of both debtors and banks with these mortgage contracts during and after the Panic of 1819 convinced frontier bankers that enslaved lives were not only acceptable, but were superior to other assets. Thus, during the 1820s and 30s, bankers operating on the frontier were increasingly willing to initiate new long-term loans secured by enslaved individuals, and even to finance the initial purchase of plantations and enslaved lives secured by the same property, often in defiance of the terms of their charters. Yet the financing needs of the people pouring into Western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana greatly surpassed what these conservative banks could offer, even with their most creative interpretations of the discounting function. For the planters, large, long-term loans secured by their plantations and enslaved workers were essential for their survival and growth. State legislatures in places like Louisiana initially tried to work within the confines of traditional commercial banks to meet these needs. In 1824, for example, the legislature chartered the Bank of Louisiana with $4 million in capital, which was half owned by the state. While the bank was permitted to discount for up to 4 months, twice as long as traditional banks permitted, it was required to lend at least half of its capital in long-term mortgages of up to $5,000, payable in 5 years. The rules and regulations for conducting the business of the Bank of Louisiana recognized that enslaved people were legally classified as immovable property in Louisiana, and thus could be used as part of this mortgage security. Other Louisiana banks soon followed this model. This shift to long-term property lending had a substantial effect on the credit options of planters in Louisiana. Large mortgages, directly secured by land and human property, became the norm for institutions like the Bank of Louisiana. According to the charter, branch loans and discounts were limited to $5,000. In practice, however, the bank regularly approved loans of 4 to 5 times this amount. For example, one slaveholder in March 1830 received a $20,000 loan secured by a mortgage on his St. Charles sugar plantation and 49 enslaved workers, which he would not pay off until 8 years later. The following year, the bank lent the same amount to another pair of planters on their plantation and 58 enslaved lives in Lafourche Parish. The partners remained indebted to the bank until 1838, when they sold the plantation to other slaveholders who assumed payment on the same mortgage. In April 1831, another pair of slaveholders mortgaged their sugar plantation in Jefferson Parish with 149 enslaved workers in exchange for a $25,000 loan. They faithfully paid it off over the next 5 years, fulfilling the terms by February of 1836. So although property loans at the bank were supposed to be limited to 5 years, they extended well beyond that limit in 2 of the 3 examples I just gave, and those were not unusual. The Bank of Louisiana regularly permitted longer terms, as long as the debtor continued to make at least partial annual payments, and the bank deemed the debtor still to be a sound risk. One cotton planter in West Feliciana mortgaged his plantation and 83 enslaved individuals to the bank in January of 1826 in return for a loan of $28,000. This planter must have consistently paid enough of the principal and interest of this loan that the bank permitted it to extend for over 12 years. Finally, in August of 1838, the bank received the full amount of said loan and it released him from the mortgage. But even these banking options were not adequate. Louisiana merchants and planters both lobbied the legislature for even more banks. The legislature responded by chartering the City Bank of New Orleans in 1831 with a capital of $2 million. 2 years later, they chartered the Mechanics and Traders Bank, also capitalized at $2 million. And then in 1836, the Merchants Bank of New Orleans opened with a capital of $1 million. The Merchants Bank permitted up to 8 years for the payment of mortgages and specifically listed, quote, land and slaves as suitable collateral on these loans. 1/3 of the Merchants Bank capital was designated for, quote, planters of this state living out of the city of New Orleans. But these new banks still did not address the substantial demands of Louisiana's planters, especially the sugar planters. Whereas cotton could be profitably produced on plantations of all sizes with only minimal economies of scale accruing to larger producers, sugar was a capital-intensive crop that experienced substantial economies of scale. Successful sugar planters appear to have required a minimum of at least $100,000 in assets, or about $2.5 to $3 million today, for the requisite land, buildings, equipment, and enslaved labor to run a successful enterprise. The capital-intensive nature of sugar production left the planters with an unmet need for access to banking services, especially long-term loans secured by this valuable property. Rather than continuing to try to fit the system of slavery into the traditional commercial banking apparatus, Southerners began reimagining the relationship between banking and slavery. One result of this reimagining was the formation of amount of paid-in capital from their shareholders in order to begin operations. In contrast, the charters of plantation banks required no paid-in capital to begin operations. The reserves of the bank were based solely on borrowed money. Investors mortgaged their plantations and enslaved laborers in return for bank shares, and the entirety of the bank's capital stock was based on these mortgages. But this practice still left the bank with no specie reserves for the issuance of banknotes or loans. Initially, plantation banks tried to sell bonds to raise the requisite specie. Annual principal and interest payments by future mortgage debtors would pay the interest on these bonds. But investors were wary of investing in mortgage-backed bonds without any further security. In order to get around this problem, the state of Louisiana agreed to issue Louisiana state bonds, giving the bonds to the bank in exchange for collateral, the long-term mortgages on these same plantations and enslaved lives. The bank sold these state bonds to investors in the Northeast or overseas, who paid the bank in gold and silver. The bond purchasers had more confidence in the securities since they were guaranteed by the state and ultimately the taxpayers. This specie then enabled the bank to begin issuing banknotes and extending loans on a fractional or reserve basis. Although the state gained nothing directly from this setup, it would indirectly benefit from a successful institution and the success of its plantations. And the state remained confident in the bank's ability to pay the interest and principal on bonds backed by the valuable land and enslaved workers of the region's booming cotton and sugar economy. Louisiana chartered 3 of these institutions, the first with a capitalization of $2 million, the second with $8 million, and the third with $12 million. This model would also be copied in Arkansas, Mississippi, and the territory of Florida. Stock subscriptions quickly poured into all of these Louisiana plantation banks, particularly from the sugar-growing areas of the state. This expanding banking infrastructure, with its emphasis on large, long-term loans backed by landed and enslaved property, was critical to the development of the frontier South during the 1820s and 30s, and marked the pinnacle of the financialization of slavery in the United States. And these plantation banks were based on sophisticated financial concepts. While Southerners might not have had the jargon to describe these ideas fully, they had found a way to monetize their human property. Enslaved labor was first an input in production, generating profitable crops for a global market. With the closing of the international slave trade, enslaved people became a store of value for their owners, particularly given their positive rate of natural increase in North America. Slaveholders could not only buy and sell people as needed like any other asset, but they could literally grow their wealth by breeding enslaved children. Yet this substantial investment in land and human property was not very liquid. It tied up capital and limited further investment in the region's economy. Frontier banks, however, solved this problem by allowing slaveholders to leverage their stored wealth in enslaved people. Slaveholders could now borrow against the market value of enslaved bodies in anticipation of repaying the debt, either from future profits or the appreciation and value of the enslaved life itself. Like a home equity loan, they could tap into the value of their human property while still enjoying the full advantage of their profitable labor, natural increase, and appreciating market value. Even more, enslaved people became abstract, fungible assets as part of bond instruments that could be bought and sold on the world's most modern financial exchanges. And unlike the slaveholders, traders of these instruments could remain willfully ignorant of the enslaved lives upon which their investments were based. The success of both the plantation banks and those traditional banks engaged in large long-term lending secured by property depended on market stability of the underlying assets, the land and enslaved people. And even with the memories of the Panic of 1819, no one was prepared for the possibility of the economy again collapsing. And just as leverage multiplies the wealth-producing effects of an asset in good economic times, it greatly exacerbates the losses in a downturn. The panics of 1837 and 1839 and the resulting recession highlighted the shortcomings of relying so heavily on human property and credit relationships. Southerners quickly found that they had over-leveraged their human property and needed to figure out how to disentangle these enslaved lives from the collapsing banks without destroying the system of slavery itself. Unlike the previous Panic of 1819, when banks had only a limited relationship with the system of slavery, frontier banks in the 1830s had become so dependent on slavery that they faced two equally bad choices when the panic hit: foreclose on slaveholding customers and sell their plantations and enslaved workers at a severe loss, or renegotiate more lenient terms with debtors in the hopes of a quick economic recovery. Especially in the case of the largest debtors, the banks often treated them as too big to fail, repeatedly renegotiating loan contracts to avoid, at almost any cost, the seizure and sale of land and human property in the midst of the downturn. In this way, banks frequently, if inadvertently, prevented the large-scale breakup of enslaved communities that was often the hallmark of foreclosure proceedings. And in those cases where the bank did ultimately decide to foreclose, it still had to choose whether it was better to sell the property immediately, potentially at a great loss, or take ownership and managerial responsibility for a whole plantation with its enslaved workforce until market conditions improved. Having invested so heavily in plantations and enslaved lives during the 1830s, most banks chose to prop up the system of slavery rather than oversee its systematic collapse. By serving as a financial safety net for slaveholders during the Depression, frontier banks helped lay the foundation of the Southern economic boom during the 1850s. Yet despite this tendency towards leniency, banks often did find it necessary to foreclose on certain debtors. Even more so than during the early 1820s, Southern banks of the 1840s faced extended foreclosure lawsuits, greater instances of fraud, and other challenges related to long-term mortgage contracts. Foreclosures were not only complicated by the claims of multiple creditors and the confusing counterclaims of widows and heirs, but but also newer difficulties, such as the release of a debtor's obligations through federal bankruptcy proceedings, and the flight of debtors with enslaved people to the Republic of Texas. Even in the case of successful foreclosures, banks often found themselves saddled with owning and managing plantations with their enslaved workforce, property they were either unable or unwilling to sell at the going market rates. And when they did sell, the enslaved communities on these plantations were often devastated, as the people were sold in small lots to the highest bidder. The willingness of banks to embrace long-term mortgages in land and human property, and their leniency toward many delinquent slaveholders during the Depression itself, ultimately resulted in the failure of a large percentage of banks, particularly in the frontier South. These failures had wide repercussions for both the debtors and the enslaved men, women, and children who had been offered as collateral. In effect, many frontier banks sacrificed themselves at the altar of the slave system. Slavery would survive, but at the expense of the banks. The ultimate lesson of the panics of 1837 and 39 was that the financialization of slavery was extremely risky. The benefits of long-term lending on enslaved lives during boom times were mirrored and magnified as disadvantages during the downturn. In the aftermath of the collapse of the banking system, frontier Southerners found an easy scapegoat for their financial woes in the banking system itself, and now rejected banking outright as a viable option for financing a slave economy. Although banks had played a critical role in the expansion of the slave economy during the 1820s and 30s, and had successfully helped navigate indebted slaveholders through the panic, they had been merely a means to achieve this financial end. Even as the slave economy triumphed and cotton became king during the 1840s and 50s, frontier legislatures rejected the continued dominance of banks in the financialization of slavery. But by the 1840s and 50s, the innovative financialization of slavery by formal banking institutions was no longer necessary. By facilitating rapid expansion into the southern frontier during the 1820s and 30s, and then providing stability for slaveholders during the Depression, frontier banks had successfully entrenched plantation slavery in the Southwest, paving the way for the region's economic boom period by mid-century. Only the most capital-intensive sugar planters remained dependent on state-chartered commercial banks. When frontier legislatures reconsidered the role of banks by the 1850s, they were no longer seeking novel financial solutions for an emergent economy, and could instead return to the more conservative structures of traditional banks. Several Deep South states would even reconsider the wisdom of their anti-banking policies during the 1850s. Yet in doing so, they would return to the traditionally conservative banking principles of the North and the Eastern Seaboard, explicitly rejecting the innovative banking practices that had driven Southern frontier development in the 1830s. These new banks were less accommodating to the financial needs of slaveholders and the slave system. Banks on the southern frontier had fulfilled a specific need during a crucial moment in the expansion of the slave system, and then they retreated to the background. Thank you. Am I supposed to collate questions or?
No, thank you, Sharon. I think that Manuel is having a technical problem. So I think that,
oh, okay.
Thank you for this lovely talk. And I see that Stephen Campbell has a question. Would you like to ask yourself, Stephen?
Yes, hi, Sharon. Congratulations on your book. This research is very impressive and exciting. I have a lot of questions, but since it's a big meeting here, I'll just try to confine it to one general question. I noticed in looking at your book that a lot of the directors of the banks were also customers, and if you thought, I've come across that in my own research too, and if you thought that that was a major reason why the banks were so accommodating and lenient and even kind of breaking the standards of traditional banking that you were writing about. And then maybe even related to that, do you find evidence of some of these banks and the directors of these banks, are they saying that, we want to keep this slave system intact? We think our system is superior to the northern free labor system, and that's why we're being lenient to help out these slaveholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Great questions. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, as you can imagine, the directors are going to be the wealthiest people in the states, and so the overlap between the directors and the legislatures and the slaveholders is substantial, as you would expect. And so there's you definitely have a sense sometimes that, and you see this like the Citizens Bank meeting directors notes where they're trying to be lenient with their friends and family. They don't want to foreclose on someone they know, and you see that sometimes coming up in the conversation. I don't, I wasn't sure how much. I mean, it's certainly a huge factor, but that's who the wealthy are. So they're going to be overlapping here. So it's almost to be expected that that's who it's going to be, and no one wants to foreclose on their brother or their next door neighbor. The question of free labor. So it's interesting that what I did find, they definitely are talking about the superiority of their economy and their system, but they're less getting into the free labor versus slave labor debate. So I don't see them, at least in what I was looking at a lot of records from a lot of different banks, banking minutes. They're not necessarily getting into a we're better than the North argument. They are, and I think that's partially though, because most of what I am, the heart of my study is really the 1830s, where I'm looking at those meeting notes and all, and the banks really collapse after that. And most of that, like really rigorous debate promoting slave system as being superior to free labor is only emerging in the 1830s and then picks up speed in the 1840s and 50s. So I'm not seeing that as much directly, but certainly indirectly they make comments about the superiority of their economic system. And stuff like that, but it's not as direct as you might expect later in the 40s and 50s. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. We have three people in the queue. So before that, I wanted to ask you, do you want to have some 10-15 minutes extra because we started?
I'm happy to go over. I'm so sorry about the confusion.
No,
so yeah,
that's on me. And I'm actually also going through some technical issues of my own in this very old building. Sorry. So first, David Thompson, then Richard Silla, and then I'm going to read a question posted in the chat. So David, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Sharon, so much for the talk. It was worth the wait, I assure you. Just a question about how you see Northern banks interacting with this system. Obviously, the second bank, you write about that in your Journal of Southern History article, and it's well documented. I'm just curious if you're coming across kind of other prominent banks to the degree possible that are kind of wading into this territory, or maybe they are, but in kind of a slightly kind of adjusted format.
Yeah, great question, Dave. So because of the specific types of relationships I was looking at, it's almost exclusively the Southern banks and the branches of the first and second bank. Because these are very much local relationships, these mortgage relationships, I was looking for if I could find any Northern banks who are doing this as well. I found one or two that indirectly refinanced a mortgage in Georgia, for example. A New York bank refinanced a mortgage in Georgia that involves slavery. But overall, the Northern banks are going to be, the Northern commercial banks are going to be financing local mortgages in the North, not reaching out and doing it in the South. So, but that's mostly because of the nature of the mortgages I was specifically focused on. This is already a really long book. I could have started getting into, all the other types of financialization, but that would have made for an even bigger book. So yeah, I think Northern banks are involved in different ways than the specific ways I was looking at, specifically things like financing the global cotton trade, those types of relationships, but not so much on these very local mortgages between slaveholders and a bank for financing their local. As you can imagine, even today, you usually go to your local bank for a car loan or a mortgage. You don't usually go to call a conglomerate. Well, I don't know. That's actually changing a little, but up until the last few decades, it was more normal to stay local. So,
all right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dick Silla.
Hi, Sharon. Looking forward to reading your book. I ordered it after Manuel told me we could get a 40% discount by putting Murphy 40 into the University of Chicago Press. I basically had the same question David had, except I can elaborate a little more. It sounds from your answer to David like you did not study the Northern Banks relationships so much, but even if they're not in your book, do you have any notion of the interbank relationships? Like, did Southern banks borrow from Northern banks? And we know, of course, they had some correspondent relationships. And you have any notion of the extent to which, say, the big money center banks in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, and even Boston, might have had relationships with the Southern banks that allowed the Southern banks to extend their operations?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dick. And I promise you, I had you in mind as I was writing, not to make the same mistake I made in my first book that Dick pegged me on. No, that's a greght question. Actually, I can't answer to what extent they had those relationships, because there's too many banks have failed and too little documentation is there. But I will say they absolutely did have those correspondent relationships, and so definitely, you see the Planters Bank of Mississippi reaching out to Philadelphia and New York banks, and you see them having these correspondent relationships where they're using they have a up to a certain amount that they can trade banknotes. Someone can turn in banknotes on a Southern bank with a Northern bank that they have a relationship with, and those will be honored on site. And the banks talk about how their preference is to have a relationship with the second bank of the U.S. before it declines, because those are the most valuable banknotes to be able to trade. But they'll take it with some of these other large banks, and so I do have some of that correspondent relationship going on between the Southern banks and the Northern banks. But again, I was very conscious of how long the book already was before trying to get into too much depth of that. But definitely, and you see it even with, particularly with the slave traders. So the people who are doing the most movement are my local slaveholders. They're more or less staying put, so they don't have those. They don't need those to take advantage of those correspondent relationships. The slave traders, you definitely see those conversations going on about being able to take the notes up to New York and which bank they can go to trade those notes and those kinds of things. So that's definitely going on. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Good seeing you here. So I'm going to read the question by Nadine. She is currently in the British Library in the Rare Books and Magic Reading Room, which is why she cannot post it herself, but she wanted to say hi to the camera. So Nadine says, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if you were able to capture the voices of folks deemed as collateral in the archival record, or in the absence of this, the voices of folks uneasy with this system.
Oh, that's a great question, and I was looking so hard for as many voices as I could, and there are very few. So I do talk about slave narratives. Some of those talk about their experiences of being collateral, and I try to bring those voices in. Wherever possible, I try to name people by name and talk about them as people, as their experiences. But very, very few voices of the enslaved themselves in this system. even perhaps more sadly, very few people who are pushing back against this as being problematic in any way. The only people pushing back are people who question the fiscal soundness of the idea of using enslaved people as collateral. So especially after the Panic of 1837, there are people saying, wait, this is actually problematic. We don't want to do this as much. But very few people who are actually pushing back at that. And actually, now that you bring up that question, to answer back to Stephen's original question about people talking about free labor, I will say when we get to the 1850s, and there's a discussion about whether or not enslaved people should not be included in foreclosure. And there's this discussion is not because they're concerned about the effects on the enslaved people, but as they're concerned about the debtors and trying to keep an enslaved. And there's a conversation: there's homestead exceptions for a certain amount of property that you can't seize as a bank or as a creditor, so that people aren't left completely destitute. And they want to include. There's conversations to include a certain number of slaves in different states. These are all state level discussions. And as we're getting closer and closer to the 1850s, these conversations are ramping up. And that's where you do see a lot of free labor versus slave labor conversations. And one of the arguments for exempting at least one slave per creditor is that this would encourage more Southerners to buy at least one slave, because they could would guarantee that's an asset they could guarantee couldn't be seized by their creditors, and that would further entrench slavery in the South. And so there's a conversation about that slaves would be a good debt to have, and that would help the slave system overall. And so it's a little a nuance later on, but it kind of combines Nadine and Stephen's question. But unfortunately, Nadine, like, very few people are at all concerned that this is what the effect is on these communities. And even there's a couple cases where I have banks who are selling slaves to slave communities across dozens of buyers, and they say, oh, but we did everything we could to keep families together. And then you look at the actual transactions and you see there was like one family they kept together. I'm like, really? Like you scattered 100 people across 75 different buyers, and you sacrifice some of your profit to keep a family together. So it's so they talk a little bit about that, but the evidence doesn't actually back it up that they're actually doing it. And most of the times when they sell families together, it's because they don't want to be stuck with a random infant or elderly person. So usually when they sell as a family, it's because they want to make sure that person gets placed somewhere and they're not left with that asset. So it's very callous, very callous. Yeah.
Right. So Nadine responded, yes, I found private ledgers to be almost be private diaries. Found some interesting stuff in a Scottish owned plantation ledger.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's fascinating.
Which later brings us to the Atlantic/global consequences and connections of your work. But before I make that question, Paula was in the queue, and then I have a question from Holly Gentry.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Again, I have two quick questions. So the first one is a kind of macro question, wondering if you noticed any spillover effects of this relationship between banking and slavery, because it was kind of, as you argue, detrimental at the end to the bankers themselves. But I was wondering if it was important in the development of other sectors or the industries. I was thinking, for example, by looking at how planters' wealth was invested in the end. So if it had like an indirect, unintended consequence of this relationship. And the second one is a kind of micro question, which ties back to your answer to Nadine, which is, I was wondering how the enslaved persons were described as assets in this contract, because so I have two scenarios, right? In one, they are like abstract beings described as property, but at the same time, how this would enhance the security of the banker, the creditor, if he has to identify this person, right? Instead of the planter just giving some older, sicker person. So in the second side of this question, so I was wondering if this led to legal innovations in definitions of personhood and of property throughout the first half of the 19th century, because I imagine that when there were some seizures of assets, there may have been some disputes in courts about, are you giving me the right person? Is this a person? Is this property, right? So I was very curious about that. Thank you.
Oh, wow, that's a fantastic question. I'll try to briefly tackle the first half first, and then I'll get to the second one. So spill over to industries. I mean, so most of what I'm focused on the frontier South. Most of their focus is going to be on those plantations and investing. And you could, I mean, essentially a sugar plantation is kind of a factory in and of itself. It's its own production. You know, there's some spillover to things like the development of internal improvements. And so there's definitely, especially on the eve of the Panic of 1837, a lot of investment into railroad companies. In New Orleans, you're also investing in other improvement companies, waterworks, canals, those kinds of things. So you do see some spillover there, but most of it is focused on these plantations itself, at least, again, what the specific types of loans I'm looking at. Your other question is so fantastic. Yes. It's this as with everything involving slavery, this dichotomy where on the one hand you're trying to make them, you know, subhuman, that they're not people, and so lots of the language is about them is financial language about them as assets. Yet, yes, you have to identify them very specifically, and they do have lots of disputes over which particular slave was actually mortgaged and whether or not that's the one being seized, and so. There are some fantastic, almost all of the documentation will include name and age at a minimum. Some will have a color description, some will have a last name, some will have family groups, some will have occupations and other descriptors in there. So it kind of varies, but there'll be discussions where, so if you had a slave under mortgage and you wanted to sell that particular enslaved person, you had to have them released from the mortgage so you could sell them, and then another asset placed in their wake, usually another slave. It could be land or something instead, but usually it was another slave. And so you have these discussions where they'll say, I want to release Mary, age 25, and replace her with another Mary. But this Mary is younger. She's only 14. She has a different mother. She's a different color. And so you do have these extended conversations about them as people and these disputes. And sometimes you'll have a dispute where the court will say, you know what, you didn't define your assets enough. We have no idea if these are the same slaves or not, that you should have defined that better. Whether or not this affects the definitions of personhood, you know, the slave South had this amazing ability not to be self-reflective about this. So even when I, you know, my first work on life insurance, when I got into slave insurance, they had no problem defining slaves as life insurance, lives for life insurance. But then they also, you know, would take out, well, fire insurance companies can also insure them because they're property. And they didn't seem bothered by the fact that they had this discrepancy between these two things. Whereas life insurance companies would reject insuring a valuable horse because, well, that's clearly not a life. But, you know, so the Southerners don't seem to be have a problem with saying that slaves are really not people and yet talking about them as people. It's a really, again, disturbing but fascinating kind of ability that they have there. Yeah. Manuel, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Sharon. So someone, Hollis wrote down a comment that I'm going to read. So do the records that you mentioned name individual and enslaved people, or rather, if named, what types of records it identify the enslaved?
What was that last part? What types of records?
Do the records name individual slaves, or rather, what types of records identified the enslaved?
Yeah, no. So as I was just saying to Paula, they absolutely name individual slaves. Unfortunately, most don't have a last name, but they do have often family groups. So for if someone trying to trace people back to these different plantations, if they're on a plantation, some of these records. I actually had a Boy Scout in Louisiana who was doing a fabulous Eagle Scout project where he wanted to place there's a Fontainebleau national state park that was a former plantation, and he wanted to place plaques with names of the people who had been enslaved on this property. And I was able to get him through the mortgage records the names of people who had lived on this property that he could put on this plaque. So these the mortgage records absolutely have people by name, and as I said, sometimes even by family group, which is very useful to have. But I'm not sure if that answered your question, Hollis.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I was having difficulties. I am working at a later era with the Freedmen Savings Bank, and I work with the Smithsonian, and I'm working with the Freedmen's Bureau transcription project. And so I get a lot of questions regarding whether or not African Americans were involved in banking. And I was thinking of the Metoyer family of Louisiana, this very wealthy African American family. And I'm wondering if they're showing up in the records, if you have African Americans who are involved in banking, and they are actually also slave owners, and some of the slave traders who are working with Upper South plantations. I'm thinking of Paul Pascal or Bernard Rowe, who's working in who's shipping individuals from Virginia down to Louisiana. So I'm asking this because I anticipate more questions surfacing in terms of making connections to antebellum banks and the Reconstruction era banks. So that's where it's stemming from.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So definitely I have some slave traders who are involved in these relationships. So too, I try to, especially the larger plantation slaveholders who are involved in this, I try to figure out who they were in their relationships. And there's at least one that I believe was either African American or had African American family members within the family. But not many. But of course, there could have been more that I'm just not sure of their demographics. But this is also, again, because most of my people I'm looking at are from the 1830s. They could have been, as you move later into the 40s and 50s, you get more. But if you had specific names, I could run them through my database, but my database it certainly isn't full, isn't complete. But to my knowledge, there's only one family that I ran across that I'm pretty sure had some African American connections on the slaveholder side.
Sorry. Thank you, Hollis. Thank you, Sharon. So maybe one last question, and because in the interest of time, so Sharon, I wonder if you have any suggestions for areas of research that you might have found as you were preparing the manuscript for publication this year, and what was it like to write this book? As basically we all went through the pandemic, and then I'm thinking about the way in which banks have had to confront their past, especially during Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, killing in 2020. So What did you see as changing in terms of a research agenda and its broader impact on like with the public?
Wow, there's so much wrapped up in that question. So I will say my epilogue, I delve into the question of reparations and the responsibility of existing banks. And I will say, so one of the things, and this was a conclusion I came to after my insurance book, but this was only reinforced by this book, because most of the banks involved later failed. There's very few current banks that have any existing connections that you can pinpoint and say, like JP Morgan, you can say, well, they eventually bought out the Citizens Bank, and I discuss, my take on that, and ultimately, my conclusion is that if we're trying to trace individual banks' responsibility, we're going to end up with a lot of dead ends, and ultimately, the economy as a whole benefited from this. So this shouldn't be just targeting individual banks that you can specifically tie back. It's the whole economy that has to take, so the whole society that has to take responsibility. So I think it's short-sighted to try to just target specific institutions, since most of those specific institutions either didn't exist or didn't have these relationships. I think we need to take a more social responsibility than individual banks, but I talk about that more in the epilogue, and that's certainly just my kind of take on that. Other areas to explore. I mean, certainly, we haven't done. I know Dave Thompson's starting work on the implications of all the state repudiations that largely come from these relationships, and so that's one area that I think needs to be explored, and I'm glad he's doing it. Certainly these bondholder relationships and what people knew who are buying and selling these bonds and their relationship with the slave system is something that has not been studied enough as well. I'm actually interested, I've started exploring a little bit about the Southern merchants who step in as private bankers after the South turns anti-bank. Someone still needs to do finance. And so I'm interested in looking at those kind of merchant relationships and the interesting kind of, I tend to be, you probably noticed from my talk, and anyone who knows my work, I tend to be more of a micro person than a macro person. So I am not going out and looking at the relationship and the effect on the political economy in Britain and New Orleans trade. That's not my interest area. I'm interested in the micro. And so I want to see how these interrelationships are happening on the ground. And so that's something I'm looking a little bit more into, is what happens next with these merchants. But there's still a lot of stuff, I think, on the financial side that we haven't done as much with. Certainly some of those Northern bank relationships. And again, I was staying within the South. What about what's going on in Cuba? What's going on in the Caribbean? Are there relationships there? I didn't explore that. Like there's a lot that could be done with that. These Scottish Owned Plantation diaries sound fascinating. Like I'm like, this could be an excuse for a trip to London. I was lucky, speaking of the pandemic, I was very lucky. Most of my research was more or less done. And in some ways, I'm an archive rat. I could have kept going to the archive. So the pandemic forced me to stop. Yes, Nadine's pointing at herself there. The pandemic forced me to stop and just write. The archives were very helpful, especially the notarial archives. Once I knew what I needed, they would send me stuff, even though I couldn't get there. I could, send them my credit card. I had my credit cards on escrow with them, and they just send me stuff. So, and they were great about that. So the pandemic, I was very lucky that I had most of my research done before the pandemic hit, and it just made me sit down and write. So, yeah.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much, Sharon. This has been delightful. We're very sorry about the inconveniences.
I'm so sorry about that confusion too.
Beginning.
Thank you all for staying. That was so kind of you to stay.
Yes, And we appreciate everyone's attendance today. Nadine and British Library, stay hanging here. And we please keep in touch if you have any ideas as to how the Financial History Network can do its purpose, which is promoting research in financial history and the history of finance adapted to a post-pandemic world. With that, thank you so very much, Sharon. Thank you all for coming, and happy summer, happy winter, depending on your location in this earth. Thanks.